Maria Santos never imagined that cutting hair would prepare her for the most dangerous night of her life. She had been working as a civilian hairdresser at Forward Operating Base Thunder in Afghanistan for 8 months. Every morning, she would wake up in her small quarters, grab her coffee, and walk to the little barber shop she had set up near the mess hall. The soldiers loved coming to Maria's shop. It wasn't just about getting a haircut. For many of them, sitting in her chair was the closest thing to home they had experienced in months. Maria would listen to their stories about their families, their fears, and their dreams. She had a gift for making people feel comfortable and safe. Maria was not a soldier. She was a 34-year-old woman from Texas who had taken this job to support her 2 children back home. Her ex-husband had left them with nothing, and this job paid well. The military needed civilian contractors to provide services that weren't combat-related, and Maria had jumped at the chance to make good money doing what she loved. The base was located in a dangerous part of Afghanistan, surrounded by mountains where enemy fighters often hid. Everyone knew the risks, but life on the base had settled into a routine. The soldiers would go out on missions during the day, and in the evenings, they would come to Maria's shop to relax and get cleaned up. Maria had learned a lot during her time on the base. She knew which soldiers were struggling with homesickness, which ones had been injured in battle, and which ones were counting down the days until they could go home. She also picked up information about military operations, even though she wasn't supposed to know about such things. The soldiers trusted her completely. They would talk freely while she cut their hair, sometimes sharing details about upcoming missions or problems they were facing. Maria always kept their secrets. She understood that these brave men and women needed someone they could trust, someone who would listen without judgment. One thing Maria had noticed was how much the Navy SEALs stood out from the other soldiers. They were quieter, more intense, and they rarely talked about their missions. When they came to her shop, they would usually just ask for a quick trim and sit in silence. Maria respected their need for privacy, but she could see the stress in their eyes. Staff Sergeant Mike was different from the other SEALs. He had been coming to Maria's shop for 3 months, and slowly he had started opening up to her. He told her about his wife and newborn daughter back in California. He showed her pictures on his phone and talked about how scared he was that something might happen to him before he could watch his little girl grow up. Maria had developed a motherly affection for Mike and his team. She would always make sure their haircuts were perfect, and she would slip them extra snacks she had saved from the mess hall. In return, Mike and his team always made sure she felt safe on the base. If she needed to walk anywhere after dark, one of them would escort her. The relationship between Maria and the SEALs was special, but it was also dangerous. The base had strict rules about civilians and military personnel getting too close. Maria had to be careful not to cross any lines, but she couldn't help caring about these young men who were risking their lives every day. As autumn arrived, the situation around the base became more tense. Intelligence reports suggested that enemy fighters were planning something big. The number of patrols increased, and the soldiers seemed more on edge than usual. Maria noticed that Mike and his team were being called out on more frequent missions, often leaving at strange hours and returning exhausted and dirty. One evening in late October, Mike came to Maria's shop looking more worried than she had ever seen him. His usual team of 12 SEALs had been reduced to 8 due to injuries and rotations home. He sat in Maria's chair and stared at his reflection in the mirror without saying a word. Maria began cutting his hair in silence, but she could feel the tension radiating from him. Finally, she asked quietly, "What's wrong, Mike? You look like you've seen a ghost." Mike looked up at her in the mirror and sighed deeply. "We got intelligence about a high-value target in the mountains, someone important to the enemy network. Command wants us to go in tomorrow night and either capture him or take him out." Maria continued cutting his hair, but her hands were shaking slightly. "That sounds dangerous. Will you have backup?" Mike shook his head. "It's supposed to be a quick in-and-out operation, just our team. The target is supposed to be in a small compound about 10 miles from here. Intelligence says there shouldn't be more than a few guards." Maria had learned enough about military operations to know that things rarely went according to plan. She had heard stories from other soldiers about missions that were supposed to be simple, but turned into disasters. The thought of Mike and his team walking into a trap made her stomach turn. After finishing Mike's haircut, Maria watched him walk back to his quarters. Something about the whole situation felt wrong to her. She had developed good instincts about people and situations during her time on the base, and every instinct she had was screaming that this mission was going to be trouble. That night, Maria couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Mike and his team. She had grown to care about all the soldiers on the base, but the SEALs held a special place in her heart. They were like the sons she never had, and the thought of them walking into danger made her feel sick. Around midnight, Maria got up and made herself a cup of tea. She sat by her small window and looked out at the base. Everything looked quiet and peaceful, but she knew that somewhere out there, enemy fighters might be preparing an ambush for the men she had come to love like family. As she sat there in the darkness, Maria made a decision that would change everything. If something went wrong with the mission, she would be ready to help. She didn't know how or what she could do, but she wasn't going to sit helplessly while the SEALs walked into danger. Maria spent the rest of the night preparing herself mentally for whatever might come. She had no military training, no weapons experience, and no idea what she was getting herself into. But she had something that might be even more valuable: the complete trust of 8 Navy SEALs and a determination to protect the men who had become her family. The next morning arrived gray and cold. Maria went about her usual routine, but everything felt different. She cut hair for several soldiers, but her mind was elsewhere. Every time she looked at the clock, she wondered what Mike and his team were doing and whether they were getting closer to walking into what she feared might be a trap. As evening approached, Maria watched Mike and his 7 teammates prepare for their mission. They checked their weapons and equipment with the methodical precision she had come to associate with elite soldiers. Mike caught her eye through the window of her shop and gave her a small wave. She waved back, hoping it wouldn't be the last time she saw him alive. The SEAL team left the base just after sunset. Maria watched from her shop window as their vehicle disappeared into the darkness beyond the base perimeter. She tried to continue with her evening routine, cleaning her tools and organizing her supplies, but her mind kept drifting to Mike and his team. Around 10 o'clock that night, Maria was getting ready for bed when she heard unusual activity outside. Vehicles were moving around the base, and she could hear urgent voices in the distance. Something was wrong. She quickly got dressed and stepped outside her quarters. Captain James, the base commander, was talking rapidly into his radio near the command center. Maria had cut the captain's hair many times, and she could tell from his body language that he was extremely agitated. She moved closer, trying to hear what was happening without being obvious about it. "Say again, Viper 6, Captain was saying into his radio. "What is your current status?" The radio crackled with static, and then Mike's voice came through, strained and urgent. "Thunder Base, this is Viper 6. We are in deep trouble, walked into a massive ambush. Estimate 50 to 60 enemy fighters surrounding our position. We are taking heavy fire and need immediate extraction." Maria felt her blood run cold. Her worst fears were coming true. The simple mission had turned into a nightmare and Mike's team was trapped. Captain continued talking into the radio. "Viper 6, what is your exact location? We're scrambling air support and a rescue team." Mike's voice came back, punctuated by the sound of gunfire in the background. "We're approximately 8 miles northeast of base in a rocky valley. The compound was a setup. They were waiting for us. We managed to find cover behind some large rocks, but we're completely surrounded. Is hit bad and our radio is damaged. This might be our last transmission." The radio went silent after that. Captain tried calling back several times, but there was no response. Maria watched as he gathered his officers and began planning a rescue mission. She heard them discussing the problems. It would take at least 2 hours to organize a proper rescue force. Air support was grounded due to bad weather moving in, and they had no way to communicate with the trapped SEAL team. Maria listened to every word, her heart breaking as she realized that Mike and his team might not survive long enough for a rescue. She knew she had to do something, but what could a civilian hairdresser possibly do to help train Navy SEALs? Then she remembered something Mike had told her weeks earlier. He had mentioned that his team always carried emergency backup radios, small handheld devices that could reach the base if they were close enough and had a clear line of sight. The problem was that the rocky valley where they were trapped blocked most radio signals. Maria also remembered conversations she had overheard between soldiers about the geography around the base. There was a high ridge about 3 miles from the base that offered a clear view of the valley where the SEALs were trapped. From that ridge, someone might be able to establish radio contact with the team and coordinate their rescue. The more Maria thought about it, the more convinced she became that this might be the only way to help. The rescue team was still hours away from being ready, and Mike's team might not have hours to spare. Someone needed to get to that ridge with a radio and try to make contact. Maria went back to her quarters and put on her darkest clothes. She found a backpack and filled it with water, a first aid kit, and some energy bars. Then she went to the motor pool, where she knew the civilian contractors kept their vehicles. As a contractor, Maria had access to a small ATV that she used for trips into the nearby town to buy supplies for her barber shop. She had driven the mountain trails around the base several times and knew the terrain reasonably well. It would be dangerous to travel alone at night, especially with enemy fighters in the area, but she couldn't just sit and wait while Mike and his team fought for their lives. The hardest part was getting a radio. Maria knew that civilians weren't allowed to have military communication equipment, but she also knew where the base kept spare radios for emergencies. She managed to slip into the communications building while everyone was focused on the rescue planning and borrowed a handheld radio that she hoped would reach the trapped SEALs. Maria started the ATV and drove quietly away from the base, using a route that would avoid the main gates where guards would stop her. She knew she was breaking multiple rules and could face serious consequences, but none of that mattered if she could help save Mike and his team. The ride to the ridge was terrifying. Maria had to drive without headlights to avoid being spotted by enemy fighters who might be in the area. She used the moonlight and her knowledge of the trails to navigate through the rocky terrain. Every sound made her jump, and several times she thought she heard voices or movement in the darkness around her. It took her almost an hour to reach the ridge. When she finally arrived, she could see the valley below where the SEAL team was trapped. In the distance, she could see muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness as the battle continued. The SEALs were still alive and fighting, but they were clearly outnumbered and in desperate need of help. Maria set up the radio and began trying to make contact. "Viper 6, this is Thunder Friend. Can you hear me?" She didn't know what call sign to use, so she made one up. For several minutes, there was no response. Maria kept trying, adjusting the frequency and boosting the power on the radio. She was beginning to think the plan wouldn't work when suddenly Mike's voice came through the static. "Thunder Friend, this is Viper 6. Who is this? How are you reaching us?" Maria felt a surge of relief at hearing Mike's voice. "Mike, it's Maria. I'm on the ridge overlooking your position. I borrowed a radio from the base. Are you and your team okay?" There was a long pause, and when Mike responded, she could hear the disbelief in his voice. "Maria, what the hell are you doing out there? It's dangerous. You need to get back to base immediately." "I'm not going anywhere until you and your team are safe," Maria replied firmly. "Tell me what's happening down there." Mike's voice was tight with stress as he explained the situation. "We're pinned down behind some rocks about halfway up the north side of the valley, has been shot in the leg and needs medical attention. We're running low on ammunition, and they've got us completely surrounded. Every time we try to move, they light us up from multiple directions." Maria looked down at the valley, trying to understand the layout of the battle. She could see the muzzle flashes from the enemy fighters' positions, and she realized they had the SEALs trapped in a crossfire. The enemy fighters were positioned on 3 sides of the valley, with the 4th side blocked by a steep cliff. "Mike, I can see the valley from up here," Maria said into the radio. "The enemy fighters are positioned in 3 groups. There's about 20 on the west side, 15 on the east side, and maybe 20 more at the mouth of the valley blocking your escape route." Mike's voice came back immediately. "Can you see any weak points in their positions? Any way we might be able to break out?" Maria studied the valley carefully. She had no military training, but she could see the tactical situation clearly from her elevated position. After several minutes of observation, she noticed something that might help. "Mike, there's a group of about 15 fighters on the east side of the valley. They're spread out along a ridge, but there's a gap in their line about halfway down. It looks like they can't see that spot because of a large rock formation. If you could get to that area, you might have a chance to break through their line and escape." There was silence on the radio for a moment, then Mike responded. "Maria, you might have just saved our lives. We can see that rock formation from here. It's about 200 meters from our current position. The problem is getting there without being seen." Maria continued watching the battle, and she began to notice patterns in how the enemy fighters were moving and shooting. She realized that she might be able to help coordinate the SEAL team's movement by watching from above and warning them about enemy positions. "Mike, I think I can help guide you to that escape route," she said into the radio. "From up here, I can see when the enemy fighters move and when you might have openings to advance, but you'll have to trust me and follow my directions exactly." Mike's response was immediate. "Maria, you've already done more than enough. This is military business now. You need to get somewhere safe." "I'm not leaving you," Maria replied firmly. "You and your team are like family to me. I'm going to stay here and help guide you out of that valley, and there's nothing you can say to change my mind." After a long pause, Mike's voice came back, filled with emotion. "Okay, Maria, we're going to trust you. Tell us what you see and what we need to do." Maria positioned herself behind a large rock on the ridge and focused intently on the valley below. She could see the muzzle flashes clearly in the darkness, and she began to understand the rhythm of the battle. The enemy fighters would fire in bursts, then move to new positions, then fire again. If she timed it right, she might be able to help the SEALs move during the brief moments when the enemy was repositioning. "Mike, I can see your position behind those rocks," Maria said into the radio. "The enemy fighters on the west side are about to reload. When I say go, you need to move quickly toward that large boulder about 50 meters northeast of your position. Do you see it?" "I see it," Mike replied, standing by. Maria watched as the firing from the west side of the valley stopped momentarily. "Go now, Mike. Move." She watched as dark shapes moved quickly across the valley floor. The SEALs made it to the boulder just as the enemy fighters resumed firing, but they were shooting at the old position where the team had been hiding. "Great job," Maria whispered into the radio. "You're one step closer to that escape route. How is holding up?" "He's tough, but he's losing blood," Mike replied. "We need to get him medical attention soon. What do you see for our next move?" Maria continued studying the battlefield. The enemy fighters were beginning to realize that the SEALs had moved, and they were adjusting their positions. She noticed that the group on the east side was spreading out to cover more ground, but this created the gap she had spotted earlier. "Mike, the fighters on the east side are spreading out. The gap in their line is getting bigger. You need to move northeast toward those 3 small rocks clustered together. That will put you about 100 meters from the gap, but you'll need to time it perfectly because there's open ground to cross." Maria watched as the enemy fighters continued their pattern of firing and repositioning. She began to understand their tactics and realized she could predict their movements. These weren't professional soldiers like the SEALs. They were local fighters who relied on overwhelming numbers rather than military precision. "Okay, Mike, I see your opportunity," Maria said. "In about 30 seconds, the group on the east side is going to shift their positions. When they move, you'll have maybe 20 seconds to cross that open ground before they're set up again. Are you ready?" "Ready," Mike replied. She could hear the tension in his voice. Maria counted down the seconds, watching the enemy fighters' movements. "Go, move now." Again, she watched the SEALs sprint across the dangerous ground, carrying their wounded teammate between them. They made it to the cluster of rocks just as enemy fire resumed, but once again, they were shooting at positions the team had already left. From her position on the ridge, Maria could see that the SEALs were now only about 60 meters from the gap in the enemy line. But she also noticed something concerning. The enemy fighters were beginning to coordinate better. They seemed to be communicating with each other and adjusting their tactics. "Mike, you're almost to the escape route, but they're catching on to what you're doing," Maria warned. "The next move is going to be the most dangerous. You need to get to that gap in their line, but it's across completely open ground, maybe 40 meters with no cover at all." "We'll make it," Mike replied. "Is hanging in there and we trust your eyes up there. What do we need to know?" Maria studied the situation carefully. The gap in the enemy line was real, but reaching it would require the SEALs to expose themselves completely. She needed to find a way to give them better odds. Then she had an idea that scared her more than anything she had done so far that night. If she could create a distraction, draw the enemy fighters' attention away from the valley, the SEALs might have a better chance of reaching the escape route. "Mike, I think I can help improve your odds, but you're not going to like what I'm about to do." "What are you thinking, Maria? Please tell me you're not planning to do something crazy." Maria was already moving toward her ATV. "I'm going to drive down toward the valley and create a distraction. When they start shooting at me, you run for that gap with everything you've got." "Absolutely not." Mike's voice was sharp with alarm. Maria, that's suicide. You're a civilian with no body armor and no weapons. I won't let you do that. You don't have a choice, Maria replied, starting up the ATV. Is bleeding, you're running out of ammunition, and the longer this goes on, the worse your situation gets. This is the only way to give you the opening you need. Maria, please, Mike pleaded. There has to be another way. Maria paused for a moment, looking down at the valley where 8 brave men were trapped and fighting for their lives. These were the same men who had trusted her with their stories, their fears, and their dreams. They had become her family, and she wasn't going to let her family die if there was something she could do to save them. Mike, you once told me that being a SEAL means doing whatever it takes to complete the mission and bring your teammates home. Well, tonight, your mission is to get your team safely back to base. And bringing you home is my mission. I'm going to create that distraction whether you like it or not. Before Mike could protest further, Maria drove the ATV down the ridge toward the valley. She had turned on the headlight to make sure the enemy fighters would see her coming. Her heart was pounding so hard she could barely breathe, but she was determined to give the SEALs their chance. As she approached the valley, Maria could hear shouts in a foreign language. The enemy fighters had spotted her ATV's headlight and were trying to figure out what was happening. She drove straight toward the largest group of fighters, the ones blocking the SEALs' escape route. When she was about 200 meters from the enemy positions, Maria started honking the ATV's horn and shouting at the top of her lungs. She wanted to make as much noise as possible and draw all their attention to her. The plan worked. The shooting in the valley stopped as the enemy fighters turned their attention to this unexpected threat approaching them. Maria could see muzzle flashes as they began shooting at her ATV. "Mike, go now," she shouted into her radio. "They're all looking at me. Run for the gap." Maria swerved the ATV back and forth to make herself a harder target as bullets whizzed past her. She could hear them hitting the rocks around her and ricocheting off the ATV's frame. Terror was coursing through her body, but she forced herself to keep driving and making noise. She could see the SEALs moving in her peripheral vision, running hard toward the gap in the enemy line. Mike was helping carry while the other team members provided covering fire. They were going to make it, but Maria realized she was now in serious trouble. The enemy fighters were closing in on her position from multiple directions. Her ATV was taking hits, and she could feel it starting to lose power. Worse, she was now trapped in the valley with no clear escape route. "Maria, get out of there," Mike's voice crackled over the radio. "We're through the gap, head back up the ridge." Maria tried to turn the ATV around, but it lurched and died. She had been hit in the engine, and smoke was starting to pour from under the hood. She was stranded in the middle of a valley full of enemy fighters, and they were all converging on her position. "Mike, the ATV is dead," she said into the radio, trying to keep her voice calm. "I can't get back to the ridge." "Hold on, Maria, we're coming back for you." "No," Maria shouted. "You have to get to medical attention. Don't come back for me. That's an order." Even as she said it, Maria realized how ridiculous it was for a civilian hairdresser to be giving orders to Navy SEALs. But she meant every word. She hadn't gone through all this just to watch the SEALs walk back into danger trying to rescue her. Maria grabbed the radio and her small backpack and started running. She wasn't sure where she was going, but she knew she had to get away from the dead ATV before the enemy fighters reached it. She could hear them shouting and see flashlights moving in her direction. She found a small depression in the rocky ground and crawled into it, trying to make herself as small as possible. She turned off the radio to avoid giving away her position with any static or noise. Now all she could do was wait and hope that Mike and his team made it safely back to base. As she lay in the darkness, listening to the enemy fighters searching for her, Maria thought about her children back home in Texas. She wondered if she would ever see them again, and she hoped that if something happened to her, they would understand that she had died trying to save good people who were fighting to protect others. The sound of the searchers was getting closer. Maria closed her eyes and tried to control her breathing. She had done what she set out to do. The SEALs were free and heading home. If this was where her story ended, at least it had ended with meaning. Maria lay perfectly still in the rocky depression, barely daring to breathe. She could hear the enemy fighters moving around her position, their voices getting closer and then farther away as they searched for her. They had flashlights and were checking every possible hiding spot in the area around her disabled ATV. For what felt like hours, Maria remained motionless. Her body was cramped from staying in the same position, and the cold mountain air was making her shiver uncontrollably. But she didn't dare move even slightly for fear of giving away her location. Eventually, the voices began to fade as the enemy fighters expanded their search to other areas. Maria waited another hour after the last sounds disappeared before she risked turning on her radio to try to contact the base. "Thunder Base, this is Thunder Friend," she whispered into the radio. "Can anyone hear me?" Static filled her earpiece for a moment, then Captain's voice came through. "Thunder Friend, this is Thunder Base. Maria, is that you? What's your status?" "I'm alive but stranded in the valley," Maria whispered. "My ATV was shot up and won't run. The enemy fighters are looking for me, but I think I'm hidden for now." "Maria, the SEAL team made it back safely. They're all accounted for and is getting medical treatment. You saved their lives tonight. Now we need to get you home safe." Relief flooded through Maria when she heard that Mike and his team had made it back to base. Everything she had gone through had been worth it to know they were safe. "Captain, I don't think you can get a rescue team in here safely," Maria said. "There are still a lot of enemy fighters in this valley, and they're on high alert now." "We're not leaving you out there, Maria. The rescue team is already being organized. Air support will be available at first light to clear the area. You just need to stay hidden until then." Maria looked at her watch. It was almost midnight, which meant she would have to survive in the valley for at least 6 more hours before dawn brought the possibility of air support and rescue. "I'll try to stay hidden until then," Maria said. "But Captain, if something happens to me, please make sure my kids know that I did this to help save good people." "You're going to tell them yourself when you get home," Captain replied firmly. "Stay strong, Maria, help is coming." Over the next several hours, Maria heard the enemy fighters moving through the valley periodically. Sometimes they came close enough to her hiding spot that she could hear their conversations, even though she couldn't understand their language. She remained perfectly still each time, hardly breathing until they moved away. As the night wore on, Maria began to hear helicopters in the distance. At first, she thought it might be the rescue mission, but the sound was coming from the wrong direction. She realized that enemy reinforcements were arriving, probably called in because of the major battle with the SEALs. This complicated the rescue mission significantly. Instead of dealing with the 50 or 60 fighters who had ambushed the SEALs, the rescue team would now face a much larger force. Maria began to worry that the risk of mounting a rescue operation might be too great. Around 4 in the morning, Maria heard new voices in the valley. These sounded different from the local fighters who had been searching for her earlier. The conversations seemed more organized and professional. She suspected that enemy military leaders had arrived to take control of the situation. Maria tried to radio the base to warn them about the increased enemy presence, but she discovered that her radio battery was running low. She had been using it sparingly, but the device was getting old, and the battery wasn't holding a full charge anymore. "Thunder Base, this is Thunder Friend," she whispered as quietly as possible while still hopping to be heard. "Go ahead, Thunder Friend," came Captain's voice. "Captain, I'm hearing helicopters and new voices in the valley. I think enemy reinforcements have arrived. The situation down here is getting more complicated." There was a pause before the captain responded. "Understood, Maria. We're tracking increased enemy activity in your area. The rescue mission is going to be more challenging than we initially planned." Maria could hear the concern in the captain's voice. She realized that her rescue was becoming a major military operation that could put many more lives at risk. The thought of other soldiers being endangered because of her situation made her feel sick. "Captain, maybe you should reconsider the rescue mission," Maria said quietly. "I don't want anyone else getting hurt because of my situation." "That's not how we operate, Maria. We don't leave people behind. The rescue mission is a go. You just focus on staying hidden until we can get to you." As dawn approached, Maria could hear increased activity throughout the valley. The enemy forces were clearly preparing for something, probably expecting the rescue mission. She began to worry that the rescue team would be walking into the same kind of ambush that had trapped the SEALs. When the first light of dawn appeared in the sky, Maria heard the distinctive sound of military helicopters approaching. These were definitely American aircraft, probably Apache gunships and transport helicopters for the rescue mission. The sound of the helicopters triggered immediate activity from the enemy fighters throughout the valley. Maria could hear shouting and the sounds of weapons being prepared for battle. She realized she was about to be in the middle of another major firefight. The first helicopter to appear was an Apache gunship that began engaging enemy positions throughout the valley. Maria could see rockets and machine gun fire lighting up the mountainsides as the gunship targeted the enemy fighters' positions. "Thunder friend, this is Rescue 6, came a new voice over her radio. "We have visual on the valley. Can you give us your exact location?" Maria looked around her hiding spot, trying to find landmarks that would help the rescue team locate her. "Rescue 6, I'm in a small depression in the rocks about 300 meters northeast of a burned-out ATV. There are 3 large boulders forming a triangle about 50 meters south of my position." "Copy that, Thunder friend. We see the ATV and the boulder formation. Stay down and keep your head covered. We're going to clear the enemy fighters from your area, then send in the rescue helicopter." For the next 20 minutes, Maria experienced the most intense combat she could have imagined. Apache gunships circled overhead, engaging enemy positions with rockets and machine guns. The sound was deafening, and she could feel the ground shaking from explosions nearby. Enemy fighters were shooting back with small arms and rocket-propelled grenades, trying to bring down the helicopters. Several times, Maria heard RPGs exploding close enough to shower her hiding spot with dirt and rock fragments. Through it all, she remained pressed against the bottom of her rocky depression, praying that she wouldn't be hit by stray bullets or shrapnel. She could hear pieces of metal and rock hitting the ground around her as the battle raged overhead. Finally, the shooting began to die down. The Apache gunships had systematically eliminated or driven off most of the enemy fighters in the immediate area around Maria's position. "Thunder friend, this is Rescue 6. We're coming in to get you. When you hear the helicopter landing, run toward the sound as fast as you can. We won't be able to stay on the ground long." Maria could hear the rescue helicopter approaching. It was a Black Hawk, and it was coming in fast and low to minimize its exposure to enemy fire. She gathered her small backpack and prepared to run. The helicopter touched down about 100 meters from her position. Maria could see soldiers jumping out and forming a protective perimeter while one of them ran toward her location. Maria Santos," the soldier was shouting. "Where are you?" "Here," Maria called back, standing up from her hiding spot and waving her arms. "I'm here." The soldier reached her quickly and grabbed her arm. "I'm Sergeant Williams. We're getting you out of here right now. Can you run?" "Yes," Maria replied, adrenaline giving her strength despite her exhaustion. They ran together toward the waiting helicopter while the other soldiers provided covering fire. Maria could see enemy fighters in the distance, regrouping and preparing to attack the helicopter. The rescue team had maybe 30 seconds before they would come under heavy fire again. Sergeant Williams practically threw Maria into the helicopter and jumped in behind her. "Go, go, go," he shouted to the pilot. The Black Hawk lifted off just as enemy bullets began hitting the ground where it had been landing. Maria looked out the window and saw muzzle flashes throughout the valley as the remaining enemy fighters tried desperately to bring down the rescue helicopter. The Apache gunships provided covering fire as the Black Hawk climbed rapidly and headed back toward base. Within minutes, they were clear of the enemy-controlled area and flying over friendly territory. Maria sat back in her seat, finally allowing herself to believe that she was safe. She was exhausted, scared, and shaking uncontrollably, but she was alive. More importantly, Mike and his entire SEAL team were alive because of the risks she had taken. As the helicopter approached the base, Maria could see crowds of soldiers gathered on the landing pad. Word had spread throughout the base about the civilian hairdresser who had helped rescue 8 trapped Navy SEALs, and everyone wanted to see her return home safely. The helicopter touched down on the base landing pad, and Maria was immediately surrounded by medics, soldiers, and base personnel. Everyone seemed to be talking at once, asking if she was okay and expressing amazement at what she had accomplished during the night. Captain pushed through the crowd and helped Maria off the helicopter. "Maria, you did something extraordinary tonight. 8 Navy SEALs are alive because of your courage and quick thinking." Maria was still shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline, but she managed to smile. "Are they really all okay? Is going to be all right. Is in surgery right now, but the doctors expect him to make a full recovery," Captain assured her. The bullet went through his leg muscle without hitting any major arteries or bones. He'll be back on his feet in a few weeks. As they walked toward the medical center, Maria saw Mike and the other SEALs waiting for her. They all looked tired and dirty from their ordeal, but they were alive and safe. When Mike saw her, he broke away from the group and ran over to give her a careful hug. "Maria, I can't believe what you did tonight," Mike said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved all of our lives. I don't know how we can ever repay you." "You don't owe me anything," Maria replied. "You and your team are like family to me. Family doesn't keep score." The other SEALs gathered around them, and Maria was amazed to see tears in the eyes of these tough, elite warriors. These were men who faced danger every day without showing fear, but they were clearly moved by what had happened. "Ma'am, we want you to know that what you did tonight was the bravest thing any of us have ever seen," said Petty Officer First Class Jackson, the team's demolitions expert. "You risked your life to save ours, and you did it with no military training and no weapons. That takes a special kind of courage." The team medic, Petty Officer Second Class Martinez, stepped forward. "Mrs. Santos, in our world we have a saying, the only easy day was yesterday. But tonight, you made our impossible day possible. You'll always be one of us now." Maria felt overwhelmed by their words and their obvious affection. These men had become so important to her during her time on the base, and knowing that she had been able to help them in their moment of greatest need felt like the most meaningful thing she had ever done in her life. The base doctor insisted on examining Maria thoroughly to make sure she hadn't been injured during her ordeal. Apart from some cuts and bruises from hiding in the rocks, she was physically fine. Emotionally, she was still processing everything that had happened. Over the next few days, word of Maria's heroic actions spread beyond the base. Military commanders at higher levels heard the story of the civilian hairdresser who had helped rescue 8 Navy SEALs from a deadly ambush. News reporters caught wind of the story and began requesting interviews. Captain called Maria to his office 3 days after the rescue. "Maria, I've been getting calls from people all the way up to the Pentagon about what happened. This story has captured people's attention in a way that very few military stories do." "I hope I haven't caused any problems," Maria said, worried that she might have broken too many rules during the rescue operation. "Problems?" Captain laughed. "Maria, you're being recommended for the highest civilian honor that the military can bestow. The Secretary of Defense wants to personally present you with the Medal for Distinguished Public Service." Maria was stunned. She had never heard of such an award, and the idea that she might receive recognition from the highest levels of the military seemed impossible to believe. "Captain, I appreciate the recognition, but I really don't think what I did was anything special. Anyone who cared about those men would have done the same thing." "Maria, that's where you're wrong," Captain said seriously. "Most people, even people who care deeply about others, would never have had the courage to do what you did. You drove alone into a valley full of enemy fighters to save 8 men who were trapped. That's not something that just anyone would do." The award ceremony was held at the base 2 weeks later. Military officials flew in from around the world to attend, and Maria's children were brought from Texas to watch their mother receive the medal. The ceremony was also attended by Mike's wife and baby daughter, along with family members of the other rescued SEALs. During the ceremony, the commanding general read a citation that brought tears to Maria's eyes. "For exceptionally meritorious service and courage beyond the call of duty, Maria Santos risked her life to save 8 trapped Navy SEALs during combat operations in Afghanistan." Without regard for her own safety, Ms. Santos used her civilian vehicle and radio to coordinate the rescue of surrounded American forces, ultimately sacrificing her own safety to ensure their escape from an overwhelming enemy force. Her actions exemplify the highest ideals of service to others and demonstrate that heroism can be found in the most unexpected places. After receiving the medal, Maria was asked to speak to the assembled crowd. She looked out at all the military personnel, family members, and officials, feeling overwhelmed by the attention. "I'm not comfortable being called a hero," Maria began. "Heroes are people who choose to put themselves in danger to help others as part of their job. That describes every soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine in this room. I'm just a hairdresser who couldn't stand the thought of losing the men who had become my family." She looked over at Mike and his teammates who were standing at attention in the front row. "These 8 Navy SEALs taught me what courage really looks like. They go into danger every day to protect people they've never met, in places far from home, fighting for ideals they believe in. All I did was help them when they needed it most. That's not heroism, that's just what family does for each other. When Maria finished speaking, the entire assembly gave her a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. But the moment that meant the most to her was when Mike's baby daughter, who was now walking, broke away from her mother and toddled over to Maria with her arms outstretched. Maria picked up the little girl, and Mike came over to stand beside them. "Maria, I want Emma to grow up knowing about you. I want her to know that there are people in this world who will risk everything to help others, even when they don't have to. I want her to know that real heroes don't always wear uniforms." 3 months later, Maria's contract at the base expired, and it was time for her to return home to Texas. The night before she left, the SEALs threw a farewell party for her in the mess hall. The entire base attended, and Maria was presented with a plaque signed by every person stationed there. But the gift that meant the most to her was a simple photo album that Mike and his team had put together. It contained pictures of all the SEALs with their families, along with personal notes from each of them thanking her for what she had done. Mike's note read, "Maria, you saved more than our lives that night. You saved my daughter's father, Jackson's son's dad, and Martinez's wife's husband. You saved 8 families from heartbreak, and you did it because you have a heart bigger than anyone I've ever known. Thank you for being our guardian angel." As Maria packed her belongings and prepared to leave Afghanistan, she reflected on how much the experience had changed her. She had come to the base as a single mother trying to make enough money to support her children. She was leaving as someone who had discovered reserves of courage and strength that she never knew she possessed. More importantly, she had learned that family isn't just about blood relationships. The bonds she had formed with Mike and his team, and with many other soldiers on the base, were as strong as any family ties. She had found her military family, and they had found their civilian guardian angel. Maria returned to Texas and resumed her life as a hairdresser, but she was forever changed by her experience. She continued to correspond with Mike and the other SEALs, following their careers and celebrating their achievements. Several of them visited her in Texas when they were on leave, and she became an honorary aunt to their children. Years later, when people asked Maria about her time in Afghanistan and the night she helped rescue 8 Navy SEALs, she would always give the same answer. "I was just a hairdresser who found herself in a situation where she could help some very brave men. I did what anyone with a heart would do. The real heroes are the men and women who wear the uniform and put themselves in harm's way every day to protect the rest of us." But to Mike and 7 other Navy SEALs, Maria Santos would always be the civilian hairdresser who became a hero when they needed her most. She proved that heroism doesn't require military training or special equipment. It only requires the courage to act when others need help, regardless of the personal cost. Maria's story became part of military legend, told in training courses and repeated in mess halls around the world. It served as a reminder that support for military personnel can come from the most unexpected sources, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not by soldiers, but by ordinary civilians who refuse to let extraordinary circumstances defeat their compassion for others. The night Maria Santos drove into a valley full of enemy fighters to save 8 trapped Navy SEALs, she discovered that being a hero isn't about having special powers or training. It's about having a heart willing to risk everything for the people you care about, and the courage to act on that willingness when the moment demands. Maria Santos never imagined that cutting hair would prepare her for the most dangerous night of her life. She had been working as a civilian hairdresser at Forward Operating Base Thunder in Afghanistan for 8 months. Every morning, she would wake up in her small quarters, grab her coffee, and walk to the little barber shop she had set up near the mess hall. The soldiers loved coming to Maria's shop. It wasn't just about getting a haircut. For many of them, sitting in her chair was the closest thing to home they had experienced in months. Maria would listen to their stories about their families, their fears, and their dreams. She had a gift for making people feel comfortable and safe. Maria was not a soldier. She was a 34-year-old woman from Texas who had taken this job to support her 2 children back home. Her ex-husband had left them with nothing, and this job paid well. The military needed civilian contractors to provide services that weren't combat-related, and Maria had jumped at the chance to make good money doing what she loved. The base was located in a dangerous part of Afghanistan, surrounded by mountains where enemy fighters often hid. Everyone knew the risks, but life on the base had settled into a routine. The soldiers would go out on missions during the day, and in the evenings, they would come to Maria's shop to relax and get cleaned up. Maria had learned a lot during her time on the base. She knew which soldiers were struggling with homesickness, which ones had been injured in battle, and which ones were counting down the days until they could go home. She also picked up information about military operations, even though she wasn't supposed to know about such things. The soldiers trusted her completely. They would talk freely while she cut their hair, sometimes sharing details about upcoming missions or problems they were facing. Maria always kept their secrets. She understood that these brave men and women needed someone they could trust, someone who would listen without judgment. One thing Maria had noticed was how much the Navy SEALs stood out from the other soldiers. They were quieter, more intense, and they rarely talked about their missions. When they came to her shop, they would usually just ask for a quick trim and sit in silence. Maria respected their need for privacy, but she could see the stress in their eyes. Staff Sergeant Mike was different from the other SEALs. He had been coming to Maria's shop for 3 months, and slowly he had started opening up to her. He told her about his wife and newborn daughter back in California. He showed her pictures on his phone and talked about how scared he was that something might happen to him before he could watch his little girl grow up. Maria had developed a motherly affection for Mike and his team. She would always make sure their haircuts were perfect, and she would slip them extra snacks she had saved from the mess hall. In return, Mike and his team always made sure she felt safe on the base. If she needed to walk anywhere after dark, one of them would escort her. The relationship between Maria and the SEALs was special, but it was also dangerous. The base had strict rules about civilians and military personnel getting too close. Maria had to be careful not to cross any lines, but she couldn't help caring about these young men who were risking their lives every day. As autumn arrived, the situation around the base became more tense. Intelligence reports suggested that enemy fighters were planning something big. The number of patrols increased, and the soldiers seemed more on edge than usual. Maria noticed that Mike and his team were being called out on more frequent missions, often leaving at strange hours and returning exhausted and dirty. One evening in late October, Mike came to Maria's shop looking more worried than she had ever seen him. His usual team of 12 SEALs had been reduced to 8 due to injuries and rotations home. He sat in Maria's chair and stared at his reflection in the mirror without saying a word. Maria began cutting his hair in silence, but she could feel the tension radiating from him. Finally, she asked quietly, "What's wrong, Mike? You look like you've seen a ghost." Mike looked up at her in the mirror and sighed deeply. "We got intelligence about a high-value target in the mountains, someone important to the enemy network. Command wants us to go in tomorrow night and either capture him or take him out." Maria continued cutting his hair, but her hands were shaking slightly. "That sounds dangerous. Will you have backup?" Mike shook his head. "It's supposed to be a quick in-and-out operation, just our team. The target is supposed to be in a small compound about 10 miles from here. Intelligence says there shouldn't be more than a few guards." Maria had learned enough about military operations to know that things rarely went according to plan. She had heard stories from other soldiers about missions that were supposed to be simple, but turned into disasters. The thought of Mike and his team walking into a trap made her stomach turn. After finishing Mike's haircut, Maria watched him walk back to his quarters. Something about the whole situation felt wrong to her. She had developed good instincts about people and situations during her time on the base, and every instinct she had was screaming that this mission was going to be trouble. That night, Maria couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Mike and his team. She had grown to care about all the soldiers on the base, but the SEALs held a special place in her heart. They were like the sons she never had, and the thought of them walking into danger made her feel sick. Around midnight, Maria got up and made herself a cup of tea. She sat by her small window and looked out at the base. Everything looked quiet and peaceful, but she knew that somewhere out there, enemy fighters might be preparing an ambush for the men she had come to love like family. As she sat there in the darkness, Maria made a decision that would change everything. If something went wrong with the mission, she would be ready to help. She didn't know how or what she could do, but she wasn't going to sit helplessly while the SEALs walked into danger. Maria spent the rest of the night preparing herself mentally for whatever might come. She had no military training, no weapons experience, and no idea what she was getting herself into. But she had something that might be even more valuable: the complete trust of 8 Navy SEALs and a determination to protect the men who had become her family. The next morning arrived gray and cold. Maria went about her usual routine, but everything felt different. She cut hair for several soldiers, but her mind was elsewhere. Every time she looked at the clock, she wondered what Mike and his team were doing and whether they were getting closer to walking into what she feared might be a trap. As evening approached, Maria watched Mike and his 7 teammates prepare for their mission. They checked their weapons and equipment with the methodical precision she had come to associate with elite soldiers. Mike caught her eye through the window of her shop and gave her a small wave. She waved back, hoping it wouldn't be the last time she saw him alive.